afternoon, everyone. I'm Susan Chakalu-Signan, Director of Marketing and Program Development for the Friends and Foundation of the Rochester Public Library. FFRPL raises funds, presents programs, supports special projects, helps to create specialized spaces, and purchases supplemental materials and equipment for the Rochester Public Library. And we welcome you to the final Book Sandwiched In review for spring 2022. We ask that you please silence your cell phones at this time. Our thanks go to those who help fund programs like these through FFRPL, the dedicated FFRPL committee members who curate and organize these events, our guest speakers and artists who so graciously share their time and talents with us, the library staff who help with our setup and production, and the thousands of people who attend each year. We do have a bit of housekeeping, as always. We invite you to visit the FFRPL Library Bookstore after today's program for unique literary-themed gifts, as well as books of all genres. Masking is recommended but not required in the library at this time. We do have masks in the back for anyone who needs one or wants one for the program. We have had a bit of a delay in posting the videos of BSI reviews this season, but we will have all of them posted and available with closed captioning by the end of May. If you are having difficulty hearing at any time during the program, please just raise your hand and we will adjust the volume. To access the induction loop in the auditorium, please set your hearing aid to the T switch. We thank you for helping to make it possible for us to present in-person events while keeping everyone safe during the ongoing pandemic. Today's review is of Under a White Sky, The Nature of the Future by Elizabeth Kolbert. Since we like to share information on relevant library resources at these events, we wanted to let everyone know that you can borrow items related to science and environmental issues from the Science Division on the third floor of this building, including the specialized science kits we have displayed here: the World Globe, Fuel Cell Car and Experiment Kit, the Powerhouse Kit for Sustainable Living in the 21st Century, which provides an introduction to renewable energy sources, and of course, the telescope. And we are curious if we could just have a show of hands if any of you already knew that the library had these kinds of resources available for loan. Was anyone aware? Yes, a few. Okay, so it's new information to most of you. Our reviewer today is Jeff Wyatt. Dr. Wyatt is professor and chair of comparative medicine at the University of Rochester's School of Medicine and Dentistry. He served as director of animal health and conservation at the Seneca Park Zoo in a part-time capacity for 35 years, from 1982 until 2018, and he continues to currently serve as the environmental justice advocate at the zoo. He is also an internationally renowned veterinarian and has traveled globally to pursue his passion for wildlife conservation. Dr. Wyatt takes a One Health approach to promote ecosystem health, engaging communities in Borneo, Madagascar, and Rochester, New York. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Wyatt to our podium.
Well, thank you for the kind introduction. I'll get my notes here to make sure I get everything right here. I'm so happy to see so many people here on such a beautiful sunny day. I hope you get to enjoy the rest of the afternoon after our lunch. Last month, when I was in a Madagascar rainforest with a team of scientists collecting blood samples from lemurs. That's a lemur. That's one of the lemurs, actually, I was collecting blood samples from. Bats and rats. I had this book in tow. This book, Under a White Sky, The Nature of the Future. Our team was there searching for the next virus with pandemic potential to stop it at its source. We were at the interface of a village of bushmeat consumers. These are villagers who are desperate for food, where they are eating wildlife. So at that interface between them and the degraded, encroached upon rainforest home of the lemurs and the bats they were eating. This is a One Health approach looking for potential viruses that sound familiar to us now, like COVID. We now know that COVID virus was a novel virus in 2019 in Wuhan that jumped species. It started likely in a bat, and that's why we were surveying our bats, likely started in a bat and jumped to another animal species, which we still don't know today what that was, but that animal had close proximity to people. And then once in people, we know what happened with this pandemic that we've been struggling with for so long. These kind of stories, and especially one I'll share with you in conjunction with my book review, really highlights the urgency in being aware of and addressing climate change. Most of the people that I work with internationally have been vulnerable, have been suffering from effects of climate change, be it food insecurity and their health and poverty. You know, not that I needed a reminder, but Elizabeth Kolbert very effectively presented the sobering reality of climate change. And she also reminded us that there's no going back, there's no returning to the way nature was, the way our natural world was. Now that gives me a lot of heartburn. And now, you know, considering where I was when I was reading this book in the forest, that's why I was in Madagascar. We have projects that are restoring habitat and that are looking at community-directed solutions to save wildlife and save forest. And Elizabeth is correct in that we won't be going back to the way our natural world was, but there are areas in the forest, including the forest in Madagascar I was working in last month, that are still primary and pristine, that still have animals that are undisturbed. And what their challenges are for the animals in the trees are impoverished villagers who have no choice but to eat the animals and to cut the forest down for revenue, for charcoal, and for fuel. And so we can't blame these villagers with these short-term tragic choices with long-term consequences. We listen to them. And this is the One Health ecosystem health approach that I've been working on for the last really 20 years, connecting the dots between animals, the environment, and our health and environmental health. And that is that's what's really given my life purpose at the zoo, with our lovely animals there that are ambassadors to inspire all of us to care about wildlife in wild places. And also at the U of R, where we've been now engaging physicians, young physicians, to be what we call climate doctors. These climate doctors are sharing with their patients more and more information about the effect of climate change on their health. You know, in this bushmeat community, the villagers are, you know, as we listen, and we call it radical listening for our programs in Borneo, as well as Madagascar, now Brazil, and programs that I've been working on recently with the refugee community in Rochester. Look to the community for strategies and solutions to solve problems. We don't want to parachute in and exercise what we think is the right solution. So when listening to the villagers in Madagascar, they are the most impoverished, the most food insecure, the most malnourished people I've seen anywhere on the planet. And why is that? It's climate change. There's no resiliency in these villages for the effects of climate change. Just the few weeks before I visited, 2 cyclones hit. And the bullseye was right on our forest and right on the villages that were adjacent to it in southeastern Madagascar. And drought has made it all but impossible to raise rice. This is a rice-rich culture. And so in listening to these villagers, we asked, what could the world do as a thank you? As a thank you for saving the trees, for preserving the trees. We know you revere the forest. You have these tragic choices you are making. And in Indonesia, what we were hearing was that, if they had sustainable alternative livelihoods to logging and access to health care, they could, in fact, stop logging. And over 15 years in Borneo in Indonesia, what a success story. And we've just started this program in Madagascar, and we have high hopes, but in listening to the villagers there, they had very different needs. Healthcare was right up there, but food insecurity was the number one, and they wanted irrigation from an adjacent river that could help them grow rice. And so when you are radically listening to a community, you listen, you acknowledge what they say, and you deliver. So that's our plan in Madagascar, is to implement an irrigation strategy with the support of the community, the government, and with our donors through another NGO I work with called Health in Harmony. It's a wonderful program. I'm on their board, but we are doing work now in Indonesia and Madagascar and in Brazil and moving to Papua, all these biodiversity hotspots that we need to save. And back to climate change, it's saving trees. It's saving trees that absorb CO2, both above and below the ground. And they are a sink for carbon, and we need to recognize that. And that's something that Elizabeth didn't really focus on in the book, and I think that she was intentional with some of the stories she was telling and the scientists she interviewed. Her book that we all may know better, the Sixth Extinction, really set the stage for what's the problem. It's what's the problem, not necessarily what are we going to do about it, but what's the problem? And, working in the zoo community and conservation around the world, that's always been my talking points about, the 1,000 times fold increase in the extinction rate since pre-industrial. It's climate change. It's what we've been doing with the planet. It's, in a way, our progress. And with climate change, it's really human history. And it's been, our change in the planet has been going on for a long time. But now with the Industrial Revolution and the CO2 buildup, as Elizabeth points out, we are facing some really dire consequences, because as CO2 builds up in the environment and in the atmosphere, it doesn't go anywhere. And some of the solutions that are of these doom and gloom stories, I think there are some positive sides to this. You can't put a silver lining on climate change, but you can certainly, I think, tell success stories of hope, and that's what really makes me tick with especially my work through Rochester and both the university and the zoo. Now, we do have some tragedies to share that weren't even in this book that, make it more personal. I think if we're going to be a climate communicator, we need to make it personal, and it's personal for all of us, but personal and translational. Like for the zoo, there are a lot of penguin enthusiasts. Who doesn't love a little penguin, right? They look like little toddlers. They're so, well, I'm super anthropomorphic, but they're adorable. But they're really gangsters. But they're wonderful. But these South African penguins in the wild, one of our biologists went there from the zoo really about 6 years ago. And she had a pretty tragic story to tell. And as you may know, with climate change, the ocean is warming up and it's becoming acidified. The fish are swimming away from the equator. And as the fish swim away from the equator, those animals that eat fish are compromised, because animals cannot adapt that quickly to such rapid changes. So these penguins, as you may know, there's a mom and a dad penguin. They both look exactly the same, but they're sitting on eggs, and they take turns going out into the ocean catching fish, mostly once their eggs hatch to rear their babies. This is a sad story. And what's been happening is that, in addition, there are fur seals, these giant, they look like sea lions, that live on an island across from this rookery that we're familiar with in South Africa. Well, it turns out that these sea lions, these fur seals, have figured out a way to get a free lunch. And when the penguin, who's got a gullet full of fish, is going to feed its babies, come back, these fur seals have figured if they nab a penguin, and they don't just nab it gently, they eviscerate it. They rip it open, and then they get all the fish meal. And that is something that they have, these tragic, for us, choices to survive. What does that mean for the penguins? It takes 2 penguins to raise chicks. So now we've got this crisis of a warming environment around the equator, low fish supplies, and penguins that are facing hardships that it's tough to see a way around that. That's a story of why couldn't we have done something sooner? And that's really what I see in Elizabeth's book, that she is highlighting what seem to be maybe even bizarre solutions to climate change. And I think she's purposely doing this, and I'll cite some examples, to make us wonder, why go there? Why spend all this money and look at these technological advances that are full of possibilities, but are a bit off the wall and maybe even not that feasible to harmonize and bring to the scope that we need? Now at the U of R, as I mentioned earlier, and at the zoo, we've had these success stories, especially reforesting Borneo. And we know that trees are the lung of the planet and they absorb CO2. And over a period of 10 years in Borneo with our programs, we've saved 2,500 orangutans. And the way we did that, that's 10% of the orangutan population in the world. And the way we did it was we saved the trees. The trees, no tree, no me for the orangutans. And the same is true for the lemurs. But what else is true is no tree, no me for the villagers. Without the forest, they end up having, around the world, if they're in a biodiversity hotspot, adverse health effects. And especially with our work in Indonesia, we saw that the health of the villagers was really suffering. So we opened up a hospital with free access, and there's a whole nother long story there. And the bottom line is that we are, I think, mitigating the adverse effect of climate change for us in Rochester by saving trees in Borneo. And we know that one third of the mitigation to climate change challenges is photosynthesis. It's 1/3. It's not all of it. It's naive for me to think that planting trees alone are going to save the planet, but it's 1/3. And so, hey, that's something I can do something about, and that can motivate me and all of us to, within our own world, make a difference. And the other story I wanted to mention briefly that is a success story that is a bit in contrast to an example that Elizabeth tells when she describes the Asian carp that are invasive species that, in the 1960s with Rachel Carson and Silent Spring, Elizabeth shares with us that there was this real disincentive to use pesticides and herbicides. And so the Chicago River was getting all mucked up with plants and algae, clogging waterways. And so it occurred to someone, instead of using herbicides, let's bring in another animal that's going to eat the plants. And you've probably heard other stories about bringing in an animal that's not from that area, an exotic animal with good intentions, but it was the Asian carp. And that carp loved to eat the grass and really did its job. But guess what it did? It ate all the other fish. And so now we have primarily these Asian carp in the Chicago River, and they are invasive and they've caused trouble. And so so man fixing problems, we've now electrocuted the river. So we have electricity crossing the river before it enters Lake Michigan. And that has worked so far, but look at the efforts we've put in play, and that electricity doesn't discriminate against other fish either. And we've been looking in Lake Ontario, are Asian carp there? We don't think so, but we've been using eDNA, environmental DNA, looking for DNA in the waterways. You don't have to catch a fish anymore, or even a mammal. You can look for DNA in the environment, and we've seen the DNA in the water, but we think it's just remnants of the fish and not that they're there. So stay tuned on that. But our success story in Rochester is, she says we can't restore our natural systems the way they were, and that's very true. But if you've heard anything about our Sturgeon Restoration project, our lake sturgeon restoration, that was a fish 65 million years ago. It's anatomically unchanged, and it only took us, mostly us who came from Europe, about 150, 200 years to almost wipe them out in the Great Lakes. We polluted, we over-consume them, and it takes them 20 years to be old enough to make babies. And so with a woman at the USGS, one of my conservation heroes, Dr. Dawn Dittman, she started with me helping, releasing baby sturgeon, hatchery-reared sturgeon in the Genesee River, mostly to show that the river's healthier, let's say. They were a bit of the canaries in the coal mine. It was an experiment. We didn't say it was an experiment day one because that doesn't go over well. But we let them, we released them, we monitored them. And since then, we've released 7,000. And they are now 5 feet long. They were 4 inches when we released them. They're 5 feet long. And guess what we found last year? We found our first female who's laying eggs. She's 18 years old. That's our first female. The boys have been ready to spawn for about 4 years. They kind of mature earlier. But we have found a female, and we, late breaking news, we found a naturally spawned baby last year too. So this coming year is going to be a big celebration of the sturgeon. But what's so good about it, why I brought up alien invasive species, is that Mother Nature, in my mind, does have a way to make things right. And one of the co-benefits of the Sturgeon Project, guess what? They eat zebra mussel and they eat round gobies, 2 invasive species that don't belong in the Great Lakes. They're eating them, and they're eating as many as they can, and that's partly why they're thriving, is they're eating these invasive species. So with the Sixth Extinction, with the background that Elizabeth portrayed for us, she set the stage. What can we do? I accept that our restoration efforts are not going to bring, Mother Nature back. There are some areas that we do have higher hope for, but I'd say that any management strategy that saves animals like this beautiful black and white rough lemur, and the villagers that really do respect and revere them, will work. But what can we do per Elizabeth? If I just read one paragraph from the book on page 148, and I'll translate centigrade to Fahrenheit because I'm not a centigrade guy or a Celsius guy, I'm Fahrenheit. But this is where we are. This is what challenges we face, and it is dismal. In 2015, the signatories of the Paris Agreement committed themselves to holding the increase in the global average temperature since pre-industrial to well below 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit, well below that, and pursuing efforts to limit that temperature increase to 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit. Well, we've already reached close to 2 Fahrenheit. In either case, the math is punishing. To stay under 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit, global emissions would have to fall nearly to 0 within the next several decades. To stave off 2.9 degrees Fahrenheit, they'd have to drop most of the way towards 0 within a single decade. This would entail, for starters, revamping the agricultural systems, transforming manufacturing, scrapping gasoline and diesel-powered vehicles, and replacing most of the world's power plants. Now that is scary. It's terrifying to see that is where we might be heading. And this is, I think, the point that Elizabeth has in the book, is that it's urgent. And let's look at solutions, but also let's keep in our back pocket prevention. And so I want to highlight some of the solutions. And in many ways, Elizabeth presents binaries to us. These solutions that, what's the alternative? There's a solution that seems bizarre, but what's the alternative? And I think that's an important way to look at these solutions that are, again, technically based in science, but like even the title of the book, Under a White Sky. Let's go through that example quickly. She interviewed scientists. She is not a climate change fixer, but she was interviewing scientists, and there are scientists who believe that if we can shoot dust, and they were citing diamond dust, up into the atmosphere, we can make clouds. We can make clouds that stay put, that dim the effect of the sun's heating of the planet. and that these clouds of diamond dust will actually turn the sky white. So no longer will we have a blue sky, but it'll be a white sky, and it's because of these diamond dust clouds that we put up into the sky. To me, I mean, that's, what? Is that really feasible? And I think she did this on purpose, I really do. I think she wanted to present these ideas that someone like me would go, why wait to that point where we have to pull the trigger on something as bizarre as that seems difficult to accomplish? And so it made me think of Benjamin Franklin. So in 1736, Benjamin Franklin coined the phrase, "An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure." You all heard that, right? Did you know Benjamin Franklin coined that? And the audience that he was telling that story to were fire-fearing Philadelphians. And his point was fire prevention. It's much better to prevent fires than to fight them. And I think that with climate change, we've got to look at all the tools in a toolbox, and part of it has to be, let's see what's contributing to it and preventing it. And I think that does hold true for climate change. She gives examples of man controlling nature, man's dominion over nature. And I kind of like a phrase that she brings up, and it reminds me of the Asian carp. Her phrase is, quote, "People trying to solve problems created by people trying to solve problems." People trying to solve problems created by people trying to solve problems. And she cites more and more examples of that where we kind of got it wrong, and then we are still trying to fix things, and those aren't going well either. She cites another example of gene-edited animals, gene-edited cane toads. If you've ever seen a cane toad, they're pretty awesome. They're huge. And they're really invasive, and they are in the southern United States, but they don't like cold weather, so they are having a hard time now making their way up here. But with climate change and our change in longer summers, I don't think they'll make it to Rochester anytime soon, but I think they're moving up closer to the Mason-Dixon line, honestly. So anyway, these gene-edited toads, scientists have come up with a way to make them less toxic. They have this gland that, if a dog bites them, it'll kill the dog, and any predator. So someone's gene-edited them so that they're not toxic at all, and over time they will fall more with predators consuming them and injuring them, with hopes that once that animal's released, that these gene-edited cane toads will reproduce and make them more vulnerable to predation. Also, laboratory selection of coral reef that's more acid resistant and temperature friendly from hot temperatures. So all these efforts to try to deal with the adverse effect of climate change. And then brings up an interesting angle which makes a lot of sense. Remember, CO2 is just going to keep building up in the environment and in the atmosphere. So if we decrease emissions, we still got to do something about all that CO2 that's in the atmosphere. And so there are these really, I think, clever ways that are being thought through, but hard for me to imagine, of these CO2 eliminating strategies. And the one strategy that I want to highlight here is that would remove it is basalt rock. Now, if you know this rock, it's a volcanic rock. It's most of the volcanoes that erupt produce this igneous rock. But it has this really amazing feature to absorb carbon dioxide. And it's really common on Earth. But guess where else it's common? And Elizabeth doesn't say this, but I'm surprised she didn't. It's common on the moon and on Mars. Well, heck, we could mine the moon and Mars, because the goal is, in this one solution, is to coat planet Earth, at least many of the open areas, with this rock, with crushed rock that will absorb CO2 from the atmosphere. Now, that model seems to hold some value, because in just a publication, well since I got back from Madagascar, 2 weeks ago, there's a peer-reviewed publication in Nature Geoscience, just 2 weeks ago, that in the UK they are piloting this. And in the UK, they're mixing basalt crushed rock in fields, in crops. The basalt rock acts as a fertilizer. It also reverses acidification of the soil, win-win, and it absorbs CO2. And they believe that if they mix this to the right degree in these fields for crops, that this strategy will absorb 45% of the UK's atmospheric CO2 needed to reach net zero. 45% with crushed rock in fields. I mean, that's just really ingenious. And that's one thing about us. We can be ingenious, coming up with these, but we also really need to be more ingenious looking at ways to curb emissions of CO2 and just and have more of an effect up front. She also describes these CO2 membranes that you can put on power plants. And they're really intriguing, and intriguing enough that Elon Musk, when he's not busy with, Instagram? Elon Musk has promised $100 million for whomever can find the most promising way to eliminate CO2 from the environment, to reduce CO2 emissions. Well, also, the Department of Energy is working on this in 3 states, Alabama, Colorado, and Wyoming. And they've invested $500 million just recently, over the last year or two, in these membranes that capture CO2 as they are emitted from power plants. Because I think we all realize that it's really going to be a challenging behavior change for us to wean ourselves off of fossil fuels. But we need to work towards that and be more communicative about alternatives to fossil fuel. But here I still need to make a pitch for photosynthesis, and Elizabeth doesn't really promote that. And in fact, I did did a little YouTube search on an interview with her for a book review, and she kind of poo-poos planting trees, and maybe it's because it seems that it might be a fix that really isn't going to fix the whole package, which we know it won't. But as I mentioned earlier, it's 1/3 of the solution. And so I disagree with Elizabeth not focusing more on that helps us, empowers us to not only in our yards, but in our communities. And, another publication that was from February, just a couple of months ago, when I was in Madagascar, supports this. So we need to look more at peer-reviewed publications, and we need science to help us drive our solutions. But in this publication from Nature Communications, Boston University researchers, they examined trees that are planted on the margin of a forest. Do you all know Franklin Park? It's a park in Boston. It's like Seneca Park. It's a Frederick Law Olmsted Park. That's where their zoo is. But they were measuring the CO2 absorption of trees on the margin, compared that with trees in the middle of the forest. And what they learned was that the trees on the margin grow twice as fast, they have more opportunity for sunshine, and they absorb more CO2 above ground and below ground. And so what the heck, let's grow more trees in our urban environment. And we all know that there are many publications about the health benefits to a community having more canopy, from depression to cardiovascular disease. More canopy in our urban areas, a healthier, happier community. So let's plant trees. Now, as we are closing up, because I know we are finishing soon, I see a lot of Elizabeth's solutions as Hail Mary passes. It's like, I think, it's, let's hope this works, and these are technological attempts. I believe that she is leading the reader to still question that ounce of prevention and a pound of cure, and the idea of let's focus more on reducing CO2 emissions and curbing burning of fossil fuels. All of my One Health projects in Rochester and around the world, and my environmental justice initiatives in these same areas, they all rely on listening to communities, this radical listening, and these are community-led strategies to solve problems. We are the community. We are the community. We need to be better climate communicators. And we need to not be paralyzed by the gloom and doom. And especially younger people, I think, are feeling that it may be hopeless. And I think the stories of hope that we can offer and the science-driven strategies can help them be climate communicators as well as us. So for our communities, we need to be disruptive. We need to share solutions, and we need to educate ourselves and get our elevator speech going. Make it personal, have your own story. It's not a faraway problem. You know, the U of R just had a Clinical Translational Science Institute speaker I brought from the CDC who was highlighting vector ecosystem change. Fancy word for we're going to have more ticks and more mosquitoes with these longer, warmer seasons, and we're seeing evidence of that in our pets. You know, we love our families, but we love our dogs too. And we're seeing Lyme disease more and more in dogs, and guess where else we're seeing it? In people. Our pets are really bioindicators of environmental health and sentinels. And we're also seeing more West Nile virus. This speaker was Ben Beard, and he's an expert on Lyme disease and what's happening with people and the animals in the community. So let's go beyond this mounting sense of dread, and it was clearly highlighted in Elizabeth's book. But let's go beyond this and let's not be paralyzed with inaction, especially with our younger generation. Let's celebrate our successes. Let's help science, embrace science moving us forward. And we can press for systemic change. We need legislation to curb CO2 emissions. While we also take personal steps mitigating climate change. So, what do? You plant a tree and vote for the planet in November. Thank you all for joining today.